So thanks for having me. I thought we could talk a little bit more just about those last two talks that we've just had about the future of regulation and the impact of regulation on FinTech and what's the best way forward for regulation and to set up our discussion. And I think our last speaker put it well that regulation really needs to create the right conditions for FinTech. So how does it go about doing this? Well, first, let me just mention some of the regulation that FinTech businesses potentially face. So you have the Payment Services Directive 2, the Market in Financial Instruments Directive 2, the General Data Protection Regulation, the E-Identification Regulation, Solvency 2, Network and Information Directive, the E-Commerce Directive, and the E-Privacy Directive. Now, how many pages do you think all of that regulation runs to? Does anyone have a guess? Well, it's thousands of pages, isn't it? So how can a FinTech company deal with all of this regulation? Now, these are just the names of the regulation. If you start thinking about the concepts within these pieces of regulation, so you have the Payment Services Directive 2. It talks about, or we talk about, lawyers and regulators talk about AISPs, PISPs. There's the ASPSP. So has anyone sat down to read the Payment Services Directive? I think a few of us have, haven't it? So it can take a long time to understand these concepts. How do you make quick decisions when you're facing all of this regulation together? So that's an issue for regulators to answer. So you have these concepts like an AISP. So we've seen this in the past. The e-commerce directive, for example, had from the European perspective, had an information society service. So at the time, that seemed like a good idea. Is a search engine an information society service? Is Facebook a public electronic communications provider? So a lot of these questions came up after the fact. So of course this is an old problem for regulation. It's an old problem for law, isn't it? Definitions are extremely important. How do we form definitions going forward? How does a regulatory regime deal with fast-moving pace of technology and enable us to deal with all of the different interests that need to be cared for? Now, of course, if we turn to the banks, as we just discussed, or we turn to the incumbents, so the banks have their real concerns that need to be answered. Straight-through processing is still not possible because of legacy systems, while FinTech startups can do this almost immediately. The cost of reconciliation needs to be answered or addressed. Data silos still exist amongst almost all banks. Insurers? Well, insurers have a failure to use data. I think that's been well noted. There's also a failure to update methods for risk profiling and make use of telematics, make use of new ways forward. And then wealth and investment, well, we've also had mentioned earlier the difference between guidance and advice and understanding the border and understanding how new forms of providing advice can go forward, together with the platforms that can enable investment and wealth markets to change. If we think about technology, we've mentioned a number of different forms of technology. We have dashboards, aggregators, we have digital vouchers, we have data value exchange systems, distributed ledgers. I'm sure we'll talk a lot about mobile and the platforms themselves. And then the question then becomes around technology. Of course, who governs the technology? So programmers talk about Python being a good language for data analytics. Is that true? Is it not? Is that something that regulators need to have that level of insight into? How do we deal with the gap between how technology is moving forward on that specific level? We deal with the standards that are in between, and we match that to the level of regulation. So I think that's a key area to be thought about in terms of the future of regulation. Regulators in different jurisdictions approach this in different ways, as we've discussed. So in the UK, it's been mentioned that there's a number of different ways of approaching regulation and helping foster an environment for innovation. In other jurisdictions, it's often commented that there's a lack of engagement to embrace FinTech startups by regulators, and that it skews regulation towards the incumbents. So really, we do need a different regulatory model to be able to deal with the change in technology that we're facing. Because if there's not a change in the regulatory model, well, then there is a disadvantage, isn't there? How can new business models deal with questions of anti-money laundering that have never been answered before in a digital environment? So these things need to be, I think, answered. And we also see that there's also the comment that that a number of compliance teams, or a lot of compliance teams run to 50 to 100 individuals looking at specific issues. How can we level that playing field? What can be done to change things so that's possible? So the way forward perhaps is the model that the FCA has put forward. One is to have a specialised project, so Project Innovate, that deals with the authorisation process and provides a dedicated supervisory support. And then it also provides the opportunity to engage with other regulators and to share intel as to how regulation should be moving forward. So we've seen this agreements recently. The regulatory sandbox, of course, is the other way, thinking about customers, thinking about risk, and thinking about volume and how this can be done in a testing environment from a regulatory perspective and also from a technology perspective. So they're some of the key issues I think that's behind regulatory change, or the impact of regulation upon fintech, and what's the way forward. If we got the and another way of looking at it that we often think about is also just ensuring that the regulatory and legal issues are looked at from a technology perspective, because a lot of the discussion we have around fintech is from the financial services regulation, but we need to think about the customer issues that need to be answered. So authentication, verification, what do these terms really mean? How can we change them for the future? Data itself, so accessing data, what are the rules using data and data governance? How can we've spent 5 years negotiating general data protection regulation, but how can these ideas be taken forward so that they can practically impact, or so that they can have a practical application to the business models that we're seeing today? And then lastly, not to forget about technology infrastructure. So there's a discussion to still be had around cloud computing and the extent to which it can be used in financial services. Well, cloud computing is behind a lot of the business models that we're seeing moving forward. So how do we move those discussions forward when the regulation, when it's EU regulation that stands at the basis of the decisions made in relation to what infrastructure can be used? So they were the thoughts that I thought were worth us discussing today to set up our discussion. So that's all for me.